Grandpa wanted to abandon his dog. But the wolf did something no one expected. What drives a person to commit an act of betrayal that they will never be able to forgive themselves for? An old Uaz, rattling with all its metal innards, crawled along a broken forest road. Every bump sent a dull pain through Ivan Petrovich's lower back, but he didn't seem to notice. His gaze, fixed through the cracked windshield, was as hard as granite. Next to him, in the passenger seat, Rex was breathing heavily. The 12-year-old Labrador, whose fawn coat was already turning gray on his muzzle, fidgeted restlessly, shifting his gaze from the road to his owner. He sensed that something was wrong. The morning drive was not like a normal outing. There was no rifle, no backpack with a thermos, only a dull sense of alarm in the air and Ivan's strange silence. The car stopped in a small clearing overgrown with fireweed. Ivan Petrovich slowly got out from behind the wheel, his joints creaking in protest. He walked around the car and opened the door for the dog. Rex clumsily jumped to the ground, his hind legs buckling under him. His old arthritis was making itself felt. The old man looked at his friend, and everything inside him tightened into an icy lump. There he was, his faithful Rex, the same puppy he had brought home 12 years ago after his wife's death. So he wouldn't go mad from the silence. The same dog that had traveled hundreds of kilometers with him through this very taiga when Ivan was still a forester. Now they were both a wreck, Ivan with his bad heart and aching knees, Rex with his dull eyes and stiff paws. Last night, Ivan had been up again. His heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it was about to jump out of his chest. He lay there listening to Rex whimpering in his sleep, probably having bad dreams too. And then the decision, a terrible, monstrous decision, finally came to a head. He couldn't take care of the dog anymore. He couldn't watch him suffer, but he couldn't bring himself to put him down. So he came up with a cruel excuse. He would set him free. He would return him to the forest, where Rex had once been young and happy. Even took an old bowl and a bag of dry food out of the trunk. He poured the food onto the ground. Rex, sensing the familiar smell, wagged his tail and approached the bowl. While the dog was busy, Ivan did the last, most terrible thing. With trembling fingers, he unfastened the old leather collar. The very collar that Rex had worn all his life. In an instant, it was left in the old man's hand. Rex raised his head, feeling the unfamiliar freedom, and looked questioningly at his master. There was no reproach in his brown eyes, only bewilderment. Ivan couldn't bear that look. He turned away sharply, threw the collar on the seat, and slammed the door. He started the engine. The car roared as it turned around. Rex dropped his food and ran to the UAZ, whimpering as he tried to look through the window. But Ivan didn't look. He clenched the steering wheel with his white knuckles, pressed the gas pedal, and sped away. In the rearview mirror, he saw his dog's pale figure grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the greenery of the forest. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We are interested to know where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. It motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's get started. Rex ran as fast as he could. His old paws got tangled in the tall grass, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't understand what was happening. It was some kind of wrong game. His owner always came back. But the sound of the engine faded away, and the familiar smell of exhaust fumes dissolved in the air, mixing with the scents of pine needles and damp earth. The dog stopped, breathing heavily. He stood in the middle of a huge, indifferent forest. The silence was deafening after his usual village life. He whimpered, then barked loudly and desperately. But the only response was an echo reflected off the ancient pine trees. An hour passed, then another. The sun rose higher, and the summer heat began to thicken under the tree canopy. Rex returned to the clearing. The food was untouched. He sniffed it, but he had no appetite. His anxiety was stronger than his hunger. He lay down near the spot where the car had been, laid his head on his paws, and waited. He waited all day. A bird flew by, a hedgehog rustled in the bushes somewhere. Rex just lifted his head and laid it down again, listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to catch the distant hum of an engine. But the car did not return. When dusk began to fall, the forest changed. It ceased to be just a collection of trees and grass. It came alive, filled with rustling, shadows, and unfamiliar smells. Instincts that had been dormant for years under a layer of domestic comfort began to awaken. The smell of dampness from the ravine, the smell of wild berries, and another smell, predatory, alarming. Rex raised the hair on the back of his neck. He was a domestic dog. He didn't know how to hunt. He knew how to fetch a stick and wait at the door. The night brought cold and fear. Every crack of a branch made him shudder. Hunger finally made itself felt, and he hung his head and ate a few handfuls of food. Then, finding a hollow under the roots of an old spruce tree, he curled up into a ball, trying to keep warm. But sleep would not come. All night long, he listened to the forest without humans. And for the first time in his life, he felt completely and hopelessly alone. In the morning, he woke up thirsty. Finding a small stream, he drank greedily from the cold water. There was still some food left in the bowl, but he knew it wouldn't last long. He walked around the clearing again, sniffing for traces of the car, but they had almost disappeared. Despair began to take hold of him. He wandered aimlessly through the forest, instinctively avoiding the darkest thickets. By the evening of the second day, he encountered real wildlife for the first time. A badger emerged from the raspberry bushes, growling discontentedly. Rex jumped back in fright. He had never seen such an animal so close before. The badger snorted and disappeared into its burrow. This encounter made it clear to Rex that he was a stranger here. Ivan Petrovich returned to the empty house. The silence he had dreamed of during his sleepless nights was now deafening. He went into the kitchen. Rex's empty bowl was on the floor. Next to it was a bowl of water. He mechanically picked them up to put them away and froze. His hands trembled. He put the bowls back in their place and sat down on a stool, wrapping his arms around his head. What have I done? God, what have I done? He whispered. He tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing, that he had given Rex his freedom. But deep down, he knew it was murder. A slow, cruel murder of the most loyal creature in his life. He got up and walked into the room. There was a dent and a few light-colored hairs on the old chair where Rex liked to sleep. The leash hung on a nail by the door, and the collar lay on the passenger seat of the car. Every item screamed of his betrayal. That night, he had a dream. He was a young forester again, walking along a path with Rex. Suddenly, Rex broke away and ran into the thicket. Ivan called after him, shouting until he was hoarse, but the dog did not return. Then a frightened yelp came from behind the trees, and everything fell silent. Ivan woke up in a cold sweat. His heart was pounding again. He reached for the table where the pills were and swallowed one with difficulty. Sleep would not come. He got up, threw on an old robe, and went out onto the porch. The night sky was studded with stars. He looked toward the dark wall of the forest and imagined Rex there. Alone, hungry, scared. His neighbor, Uncle Misha, who had stopped by in the morning for some salt, noticed the dog was missing. "Where's your tail wagger?" he asked, looking around. "Did you finally decide?" Ivan nodded silently, unable to utter a word. "Good riddance," concluded the neighbor. "He was old and only tormented himself and you. Let him go and it's over." Ivan said nothing. He simply closed the door and leaned against it with his back. It's over. For him, it was only just beginning. The pangs of conscience were worse than any physical pain. He stopped leaving the house. He ate with difficulty. He sat for hours at the window, looking at the forest, which now seemed hostile and sinister to him. He had taken Rex's home, and the forest had taken his peace. Meanwhile, many miles from the village, in the heart of the forest, another outcast lived a lonely life. He was a large, seasoned wolf. His name was Gray. Several years ago, he had lost a fight to a young leader and was expelled from the pack. Since then, he had lived alone. He survived. He was a clever and experienced hunter. His territory was vast, and he knew every ravine and every animal burrow in it. That morning, he was following the trail of a deer when he caught a new, unfamiliar scent. The scent of a dog. The smell of a dog in his territory always meant one thing: danger. Usually, they were hunting dogs, arrogant, noisy, carrying the smell of humans and gunpowder. Gray tensed, his yellow eyes scanning the forest intently. He moved against the wind, his powerful paws stepping silently. The scent led him to a stream, and there, on the bank, he saw it. An old, skinny Labrador was drinking greedily, flinching at every rustle. Rex sensed its presence a moment before he saw it. He raised his head, and his blood froze in his veins. A few meters away stood a wolf. Huge, gray, with a torn ear and eyes burning with cold fire. All of Rex's instincts screamed one thing: run! But he was too weak and scared. He just froze, pressing his ears back and tucking his tail, showing submission with his whole body. He waited for the inevitable attack, the growl, the sharp teeth. But the wolf did not attack. The gray wolf stood and watched. He did not see a rival or an enemy before him. He saw an old, emaciated creature that smelled of home, food from a bowl, and human sorrow. He saw that this dog posed no threat. He was just pitiful. The wolf stood there for another minute, then, as silently as he had appeared, turned and disappeared into the shadows of the trees. Rex couldn't move for a long time, his body shaking violently. This encounter shook him to the core. He realized that his chances of survival in this world were zero. Hunger was becoming unbearable. The food in the clearing had long since run out. He tried to catch mice, but his slowness and lack of skill left him no chance. He tried to chew on some roots, but they only made his stomach churn. He grew weaker with every passing hour. By the fourth day, he could barely walk. He lay under the same bush by the stream, completely overcome by apathy. He closed his eyes, and an image of his master appeared before him. His kind hands, his grumpy voice. Rex whimpered softly. At the same time, Gray was out hunting. Luck smiled on him. He brought down a young deer. After he had his fill, he began, as usual, to drag the remains of the carcass away, hiding them in various places on his territory. He dragged one large piece of meat toward the stream. He didn't understand why he was doing this. It was illogical. It contradicted all the laws of survival. But some strange, inexplicable impulse drove him on. He reached the place where he had seen the dog. Rex was lying there, almost motionless. He didn't even raise his head when the wolf approached. Gray stopped a few steps away. He stood there, looking at the dying dog, and then he simply left the piece of meat on the grass and walked away. Rex opened his eyes when the wolf had already disappeared. In front of him, within arm's reach, lay a piece of fresh, bloody meat. The smell hit his nose, causing his stomach to contract painfully. At first, he didn't believe it. He thought it was a hallucination, a death wish. But the smell was too real. Fear fought with hunger. The wolf could be somewhere nearby. It could be a trap. But hunger was stronger. Overcoming the pain in his joints, Rex crawled toward the meat. He sank his teeth into it with a greed he didn't think he was capable of anymore. He ate, growling and choking, afraid that the wild beast would return and take this gift away. That meat saved his life. It gave him the strength to hold on for another day. And the next evening, history repeated itself. The gray wolf brought another piece of prey and left it in the same place. Rex was already waiting. He saw the gray silhouette emerge from the shadows and froze, not daring to move. The wolf left the food and walked away. It became their strange ritual. The gray wolf did not understand his motivation. Perhaps he saw a reflection of his own loneliness in this old, abandoned dog. He was an outcast, and this dog was also an outcast. They were both strangers in this world. During the day, Rex lay by the stream, while Gray went about his wolf business, patrolling the territory, hunting, avoiding people. But every evening they met at this silent rendezvous. Gradually, Rex's fear began to give way to something else. He began to wait for the wolf's arrival, not only because he brought food. The presence of this strong, confident beast somehow calmed him. He no longer felt so defenseless. One night, a violent thunderstorm broke out. The forest roared and groaned under the gusts of wind, and lightning tore through the sky. Rex, who had been terrified of thunderstorms all his life, hid under the roots of a fir tree and whimpered in fear. Suddenly, he smelled something familiar. In the light of another flash of lightning, he saw Gray lying nearby, hidden by thick bushes. He hadn't left. He was here. The wolf just lay there, calmly watching the raging elements. His composure spread to Rex. He stopped whimpering and just stared at his savior. That night, the last wall of mistrust between them collapsed. They did not become friends in the human sense of the word, but they became a pack of two lonely old souls. Meanwhile, Ivan Petrovich had reached his limit. He had hardly eaten or slept. His face was gaunt and dark. One day, sitting by the window, he saw a neighbor's boy playing with his puppy. He threw a ball to him, and the puppy, barking happily, brought it back. Ivan watched them, and tears, dry and old, rolled down his cheeks. He couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was worse than the worst possible knowledge. He had to find out what had happened to Rex, even if it meant searching the forest for his remains. He had to bury him and ask for forgiveness. He stood up. His decision was firm. He would go into the forest. He would find him, dead or alive. Ivan began to get ready. He took out his old hiking backpack, a compass, and a knife. He put a water canteen, some bread, and canned food in it. He found his father's old rifle in the shed. He wasn't sure why he needed it, but he felt safer with it in the forest. He knew that his sick heart and legs could give out at any moment. But the thought of Rex drove him forward, stronger than any pain. He got into his UAZ and drove down the same road. Every turn was a stab of guilt in his heart. This was the place where he had stopped. He got out of the car. The clearing looked exactly the same, but now it seemed sinister. The old bull lay in the grass, upside down. Ivan picked it up and pressed it to his chest. He went deeper into the forest, navigating by the sun and old landmarks known only to him. He called out, "Rex, Rex, come to me!" But there was only silence in response. He walked for several hours until he was exhausted. Sitting down on a fallen tree, he realized the futility of his endeavor. The forest was huge. Finding a dog here, which was most likely already dead, was like looking for a needle in a haystack. But he stubbornly got up and walked on. He headed east, toward the distant swamps where Rex loved to run when he was young. On the second day of his search, he came across some tracks. They were large wolf tracks. His heart sank. He knew there were wolves in these woods. The thought that Rex might have fallen prey to them was unbearable. But next to the wolf tracks, he noticed other tracks. Dog tracks. He wasn't sure, but he thought they were Rex's tracks. A faint, tremulous hope flared in his heart. He followed the tracks. They led him deeper into the thicket, to an old stream he knew well. He walked very carefully, trying not to make a sound. And then, coming out into a small clearing, he froze. What he saw was beyond his comprehension. His Rex was lying on the grass by the stream. He was thin, his fur matted, but he was alive. And next to him, with his head resting on his paws, lay a huge gray wolf, the very same one whose tracks he had seen. They were sleeping, huddled together. Rex, his pampered pet, was sleeping in the arms of a wild predator. Ivan stood there, afraid to move. He couldn't believe his eyes. It was impossible, unreal. But then Rex stirred in his sleep, and the wolf, without opening his eyes, moved slightly, settling himself more comfortably. At that moment, Ivan realized that something incredible had happened, something that changed everything. He slowly raised his rifle. His first thought was that of a hunter, a wolf, an enemy, danger. He had to protect his dog. But his hand trembled. Protect. But judging by all appearances, it was this wolf who had saved Rex from starvation. At that moment, Rex opened his eyes. He saw his master. For a moment, the dog lay motionless, as if in disbelief. Then a joyful, mournful whimper escaped from his chest. He jumped to his feet and, limping, rushed toward Ivan. His whole canine soul yearned for the man he loved more than life itself. The wolf also jumped up. The hair on his neck stood on end, and a low, threatening growl escaped from his mouth. He took a step forward, blocking Rex, his yellow eyes fixed on Ivan, assessing the threat. Rex, halfway there, stopped. He was torn. There, in front of him, was his master, his god, his whole past life. And here, behind him, was his savior, his new pack. He turned and whimpered pitifully, looking at the wolf. And in that look, Ivan read everything. He understood that Rex was no longer just his dog. He now belonged to this forest and this wolf. Ivan slowly lowered his rifle. He looked into the wolf's eyes, and in them he saw no blind rage of a predator. He saw intelligence, caution, and something else. Something like protection. He saw a creature that would not give up his comrade. "Rex," Ivan called softly. The dog darted toward him again, ran up, and nudged his hand with his wet nose. Ivan dropped to his knees and hugged his dog. He smelled of the forest, of game, and of something else, of wolf. He stroked his matted fur, tears rolling down his face. "Forgive me, my friend. Forgive me," he whispered. The wolf did not attack. He stood still and watched, continuing to growl quietly, never taking his eyes off the man. He could see that this man would not harm the dog, but he remained alert. Ivan knew he had to make a decision. He could call Rex, and he would most likely follow him. He would return to the village, to his old house. But what would await him there? Loneliness, a frail owner who couldn't even take him for a walk, a slow decline within four walls. And here he had freedom. He had a friend who had saved him and cared for him. Here he was alive, truly alive. Ivan looked at Rex, then at the wolf, and he made the hardest decision of his life. He let him go, this time for real. He patted Rex on the head one last time, stood up, and without looking back, walked away. Rex whimpered, took a few steps after him, but stopped. He looked at his departing master, then at the wolf, who had stopped growling and was just waiting. He even walked without looking where he was going. He didn't know where he was going or what he was going to do next. He knew only one thing. His dog was alive, and he was not alone. But when he had almost disappeared behind the trees, there was a crackling sound behind him. He spun around, expecting to see the wolf. But what he saw made his heart stop. A huge brown bear emerged from the thicket, attracted by the smells and sounds, and it was heading straight for where Rex and Gray had been. The blood froze in Ivan's veins. He was a forester. He knew what a bear was like when disturbed in the middle of summer. This was not just an encounter. It was a death sentence. The beast was huge. Its brown fur stood on end, and its small eyes burned with evil, hungry power. The bear roared, and the sound seemed to shake the trees themselves. Ivan raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking so much that the front sight danced before his eyes. He was afraid. He was afraid not so much for himself as for Rex. His dog, his old, sick dog, was standing right in the path of this monster. Rex, seeing the beast, instinctively pressed himself to the ground, growling hollowly, hopelessly. He was ready to die defending his new friend and his old master. But Gray was not afraid. He was a wild beast, and the blood of hundreds of generations of warriors flowed through his veins. The moment the bear took its first step toward them, the wolf darted forward silently. It was a suicidal attack. The wolf was several times smaller and weaker, but he was faster and smarter. He did not rush into a head-on attack, but came in from the side, sinking his teeth into the bear's hind leg. The bear roared in pain and surprise, turning around to try to get the intruder. But Gray had already jumped back, circling around the giant, not letting him get a clear shot. He was like a shadow, a gray ghost, appearing now on the left, now on the right, drawing all the bear's attention to himself. Rex, seeing his friend's maneuver, knew what to do. Gathering the last of his strength, he rushed forward and, barking desperately, latched onto the bear's other paw. His old teeth couldn't do any serious damage, but it was another point of pain, another distraction. The bear was now completely enraged. He shook his head, roared, and tried to shake off his two annoying opponents. Ivan realized that this was his only chance. He pressed the butt of his rifle to his shoulder, closed his eyes for a moment to calm his trembling, and took aim at the huge brown carcass. He couldn't shoot to kill. The risk of hitting Rex or the wolf was too great. He fired slightly higher, aiming for the neck. The crack of the shot shattered the silence of the forest. The bullet tore a chunk of fur from the bear's neck. It wasn't a fatal wound, but the pain and the deafening sound did their job. The bear let out a piercing scream, shook Rex off like an annoying fly, and turning awkwardly, rushed off, breaking bushes and young trees in its path. A minute later, everything was quiet. Only the smell of gunpowder and fear remained. Rex, thrown back by the bear, struggled to his feet, whimpering in pain. But he immediately forgot about himself when he saw Gray. The wolf was lying on his side, breathing heavily. During the last attack, the bear had finally reached him with his clawed paw. A large, dark stain of blood was spreading across the wolf's gray side. Rex ran up to him and began desperately licking the wound, whimpering and nudging his friend with his nose. He tried to lift him up, but the wolf would not stand. Ivan reloaded his rifle and slowly approached them. His heart was pounding in his throat. He saw the wound, deep, jagged cuts. If the bleeding wasn't stopped, the wolf would die. Gray raised his head and looked at the approaching man. There was no aggression in his eyes anymore, only pain and exhaustion. He growled weakly, more out of habit than anything else, but made no hostile movements. Rex stood between Ivan and the wolf, growling softly. He was now protecting his savior, even from his own master. "Quiet, boy, quiet," Ivan whispered, slowly dropping to his knees. "I want to help. Quiet, Gray." He spoke to the wolf as he had once spoken to Rex when he was a puppy. In a calm, quiet voice. He laid his rifle on the ground to show he meant no harm. He was an old forester and knew what to do. He carefully unfastened his backpack, took out a water flask and a clean rag that he always carried with him. "Let me see, Gray. Let me," he muttered, slowly reaching out his hand. The wolf watched his every move. He saw something other than a threat in the man's eyes, and he could smell his companion, Rex, on the man. Perhaps that, or perhaps it was weakness from blood loss, made him give in. He allowed Ivan to touch him. The old man's fingers were surprisingly skilled. He washed the wound as best he could, then took a small bag of dried herbs from a hidden pocket in his backpack. Plantain and yarrow, old, proven remedies for stopping bleeding. He rubbed the powder between his palms and carefully sprinkled it on the wound. Then he tied it tightly with a rag, making a makeshift bandage. All this time, Rex sat nearby, never taking his eyes off his master, whimpering quietly as if approving of his actions. When it was over, Ivan sat down on the ground, feeling his strength leave him. The adrenaline from the fight wore off, and he was overcome by terrible fatigue. He looked at this incredible trio: himself, the dog he had betrayed, and the wild wolf that had saved the dog. They sat in complete silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of the wounded animal. The sun began to sink toward the horizon. Ivan knew he couldn't stay there. First, the wounded wolf needed rest and shelter. Second, and this was the worst part, the wounded bear could return. And third, the gunshot. The sound of a gunshot in the taiga carries for miles. It was 10 kilometers to the hunters' winter quarters. They must have heard it, and they would come. And when they saw the wolf and a man next to it, there would be no discussion. They would kill him without a second thought. The thought burned Ivan. He couldn't let that happen. This wolf had saved Rex. It had saved him from the bear. Now it was his turn to save it. "We have to go," he said aloud, addressing himself more than the wolf. "We have to hide you, Gray." But how? The wolf was too weak to go far, and the old man was unable to carry an almost 80-kilogram wild animal. Rex, as if understanding his thoughts, approached the wolf and nudged him again with his nose, urging him to get up. Gray, leaning on his friend, made an attempt to stand. He got up, but his hind legs buckled, and he collapsed back to the ground with a quiet groan. Things were not looking good. The wound was deeper than Ivan had thought at first glance. Perhaps muscles or tendons had been damaged. Ivan looked around. He needed shelter. And then he remembered. About half a kilometer away, down the stream, there was an old, abandoned hunting lodge. He had built it himself 30 years ago. If it was still intact, it would be the perfect shelter. "Hang in there, buddy, hang in there," he said to the wolf. "We'll figure something out." He grabbed his backpack and rifle. He walked over to Rex. "Rex, lead him," he said, pointing in the direction. "Slowly. Help him. Do you understand?" Rex looked at his master, then at the wolf, and barked affirmatively. He understood everything. He put his shoulder under Gray's side, and they began to move. It was a painfully slow procession. The wolf limped along, leaning on Rex, leaving bloody drops on the grass. Ivan walked slightly ahead, choosing the path and listening to every rustle. He felt something he hadn't felt in many years. A forester again. Responsible for other people's lives again. He was leading his strange, impossible pack to safety, and every minute counted. He knew that the gamekeepers were experienced men. They would quickly find the place where the shot had been fired, and they would follow their trail. It took them almost an hour to cover those miserable half a kilometer. The hut was still there, a small darkened log cabin, half buried in the ground. The door hung on one hinge, and the roof was leaking, but it was better than nothing. Inside, it smelled of damp and old wood. Ivan cleared a corner of debris and threw dry moss and pine branches there, making a makeshift bed. With great difficulty, they carried Gray inside. The wolf collapsed exhausted onto the bedding and closed his eyes. Rex lay down next to him, resting his head on his back. Ivan went outside. He had to cover their tracks. He carefully flattened the grass, scattered branches, and did everything he could to hide the fact that someone had been in the hut. Then he walked several hundred meters away and, making a wide detour, returned to the hut from the other side, stepping on stones and the stream bed so as not to leave any scent. He knew that this might not fool experienced trackers, but it gave them at least some chance. When he returned, it was already completely dark. He went into the hut and closed the door as best he could. It was almost dark inside. He sat down on an old bench, leaning his back against the cold wall. Nearby, in the darkness, he could hear the wolf's heavy breathing and Rex's quiet sniffling. Ivan had no food for them, only his own canned food. He opened a can of stew. The smell of meat made Rex raise his head. Ivan poured half of the contents onto a large burdock leaf and pushed it toward the dog. The dog ate everything in an instant. He pushed the remaining half toward the wolf's muzzle. The gray wolf opened his eyes slightly. He sniffed the unfamiliar food, looked at the man, then at Rex, who was already licking the empty leaf. After hesitating, he began to eat cautiously. It was the first human food he had ever tasted. At that moment, Ivan realized that there was no turning back. He couldn't just leave them there. He had brought trouble in the form of hunters. Now he had to do everything he could to save this wild animal, no matter what the cost. He sat in the darkness, listening to the night forest come to life outside the walls, and felt that he belonged there. But deep inside, he was gnawed by anxiety. Somewhere out there in the darkness, the wounded bear was prowling. And somewhere out there, from the direction of the village, people with guns were surely already on their way. The night passed relatively quietly. Ivan hardly slept, listening to every sound outside. But apart from the usual rustling of the forest, there was nothing. In the morning, he examined the wolf's wound. The bandage was soaked with blood, but the bleeding seemed to have stopped. Gray looked a little better, but he was still very weak. Ivan had one more can of food, which he divided between his charges. He left himself only a piece of stale bread. There was plenty of water. A stream flowed a few steps away. The problem was something else. They needed to rest here for at least a few days for the wolf to regain its strength. But Ivan was sure that today they would start looking for them. He left the hut to look around. The morning was clear and quiet. He climbed a small hill behind the hut, from where he could see the surrounding area. His worst fears were confirmed. Far to the east, where the fight had taken place yesterday, he saw smoke. Small, barely noticeable. It was a bonfire. The hunters. They had found the place and were probably already examining the tracks. They were professionals. They would realize that the bear had left wounded, and they would find the tracks of the wolf, the dog, and the man. Then it would only be a matter of time before they came to the hut. He had a few hours, maybe half a day. What to do? They couldn't run. Staying meant waiting for Gray's inevitable death. Ivan climbed back down to the hut. His brain, accustomed to solving complex problems during his many years of working in the forest, feverishly searched for a way out. And he found one. The plan was risky, almost insane, but he had no other choice. He had to lure the hunters away from here. He would return to the site of yesterday's fight and make sure his tracks led in a completely different direction, south, toward the swamps. He would leave some clues there: a piece of fabric from his jacket, an empty tin can. The hunters would follow the false trail, thinking he was chasing a wounded bear. That would give him time. A day, maybe two. During that time, Gray should recover, at least a little. He returned to the hut. "Rex, listen to me," he said, looking the dog in the eyes. "I'm leaving. You stay here. Guard him. Not a sound. Don't go anywhere. Do you understand?" Rex whimpered, but looked at him with such understanding that Ivan had no doubts. He patted the dog, then, after a moment's hesitation, reached out and touched the wolf's head. Gray did not pull away. Ivan took his rifle and his empty backpack and left. He did not know if his plan would work. He didn't know if he had the strength for this deceptive maneuver. He only knew that he had to try. He glanced back one last time at the old hut where the two most important beings in his life remained, and walked away, leading the deadly danger away with him. Even walked, putting all his years of experience into every step. He wasn't just walking. He was painting a story for those who would follow him. A story about an old, desperate hunter who wounded a bear and was now following its trail, driven by revenge or excitement. He deliberately chose soft spots where the tracks would be deeper. He broke a few branches, as a large, wounded animal would have done. When he reached the site of yesterday's fight, he trampled around, mixing his tracks with those of the animals, and then confidently followed the trail south. He knew that when the gamekeepers found the shell casings and blood here, they would look for two things first: the bear's tracks and the man's tracks. And he gave them what they were looking for. Physically, it was unbearably difficult. Every step was painful in his knees, and his heart kept racing, forcing him to stop and gasp for air. He cursed his old age and his weakness. But the thought of Rex and Sir hiding in the old hut gave him strength. He was their only hope. After several hours, he reached the stream and walked straight through the water, knowing that this would throw anyone off the trail. After walking half a kilometer, he came out onto the bank and began leaving clues again. He, accidentally, caught his jacket on a branch, leaving a piece of fabric behind. Then he sat down to rest and left an empty tin can. These were small details, but it was precisely these details that painted a convincing picture for a tracker. He was heading for the swamps. It was the most dangerous and deadly place in the entire district. No sane person would venture there without extreme necessity. That is why his false trail had to end there. It would look logical. The old man, in the heat of the chase, had strayed too far, realized his mistake, and turned back, but on a different path known only to him. At the same time, two people approached the scene of the struggle. The young gamekeeper Pavel and his partner, the elderly and experienced Stepan. They immediately saw the trampled grass, broken bushes, and blood. Yeah, there was a real slaughter here, Stepan whistled, picking up a spent shell casing from the ground. 12 gauge. Looks like Petrovich's gun. Pavel frowned. He knew Ivan Petrovich well. He had been his mentor when he first started working in the forestry department. He had taught him everything he knew about the forest. Petrovich? Pavel said doubtfully. What was he doing here? He wouldn't have shot a bear on his own, not at his age, not with his heart. They began to examine the tracks. Look, said Stepan, pointing to the ground. Bear tracks, a big one. It's wounded and heading south. And here are human tracks. Definitely Petrovich's boots, I know the pattern. Let's follow him. Stubborn old man. Pavel stared at the tracks in silence. Something didn't add up. Something was wrong. He knew how cautious and clever his teacher was. And this action, going after a wounded bear alone, was not like caution, but madness. But tracks were stubborn things, and they clearly indicated the direction. All right, he said. Let's go see where he drove him. And they set off along the false trail that Ivan had worked so hard to lay for them. Time passed agonizingly slowly in the hut. Rex lay by the door, his eyes wide open. Every sound outside made him strain his ears. He was obeying his master's orders. He was on guard. Gray lay on a bed of moss. The wound hurt, but he felt his strength gradually returning. Human food tasted strange, but it gave him energy. He watched the dog. He didn't fully understand this creature. He didn't understand its blind devotion to the man who had abandoned it, but he saw something else. He saw in Rex a loyal companion who had not left him in trouble, who shared the danger with him, and he was grateful. During the day, when the sun warmed the roof, it became stuffy in the hut. The smells of the forest penetrated through the cracks in the logs, and among them was a new one, sharp, musky. Rex growled softly, the hair on his neck standing on end. He rose and approached the crack in the wall, peering outside. Gray also caught the scent of an enemy. Small, but very dangerous. Suddenly, something rustled in the dark corner of the hut. An ermine slipped out from under an old bench, a small, nimble predator with eyes as black as beads. It was attracted by the smell of blood and meat. Seeing the two large animals, it was not afraid. On the contrary, it arched its back and hissed menacingly. Gray tried to get up, but a sharp pain in his side forced him to lie down again. He could only watch helplessly. Rex accepted the challenge. He understood that this small animal could be dangerous for the wounded wolf. He stepped forward, blocking Gray, and growled loudly, baring his teeth. The ermine did not retreat. He darted forward, trying to slip past the dog to the wounded wolf. But Rex, despite his age and arthritis, was alert. He twisted and snapped his teeth a millimeter from the nimble calf. A real duel began. The ermine circled the hut, making lightning-fast lunges, while the old Labrador clumsily but stubbornly fended off all his attacks. He wasn't trying to kill him. He just wouldn't let him break through to the den. Finally, realizing that there was no hope for him here, the ermine squeaked viciously one last time and slipped out through the same crack it had squeezed through. Rex was breathing heavily, but he stood his ground. He walked over to Gray and licked his nose. The wolf responded with a weak wag of his tail. In this small, dark hut, far from people, their strange alliance grew stronger. They were no longer just a wolf and a dog. They were a pack, protecting their territory and each other. Ivan reached the edge of the swamp. There was no way forward. A boggy, squelching quagmire, overgrown with sparse reeds. It was the perfect place to end the chase. He threw the last clue on the ground, an old worn handkerchief, as if he had dropped it in his haste. He had almost no strength left. His heart ached with a dull, unrelenting pain. He leaned against a tree, trying to catch his breath. The plan had been carried out. Now all that remained was to wait and hope that the gamekeepers would fall for his trick. He went back, but took a different route, trying not to leave any traces, moving along rocky scree and thick moss. He had to get back to the hut unnoticed. Pavel and Stepan reached the marshes an hour after him. They saw footprints leading to the edge of the quagmire and found a handkerchief. "That's it," Stepan said with relief. He let the bear get away. The bear went into the swamp, and now you can look for him there. And Petrovich must have realized that it was a lost cause and went home. "Let's go, that's enough for today." But Pavel hesitated. He stood and looked at the swamp, and the feeling that something was wrong would not leave him. "It's too clean," he said. "Everything is too obvious. It's like in the tracking textbook that Petrovich himself gave me to read. He left us these tracks. He led us here on purpose." "Come on, give it a rest." Stepan waved him off. "You're being paranoid. Why would he do that? Let's go, we have to write our report." Pavel reluctantly agreed. He had no logical arguments against his partner's words. Only intuition, the instinct of an old hunter passed down to him by his teacher. They turned around and headed back. Pavel walked last, looking back every few steps. He felt that they were missing something important, that the real story was unfolding somewhere else entirely. They had almost reached the spot where they had turned onto the false trail when Stepan, who was walking ahead, stopped abruptly. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to a hazel bush. Pavel came closer. A small white scrap was caught on one of the branches, slightly off their path. He carefully removed it. It was a piece of bandage or clean cloth, and there was a stain on it. Dark, already dried. Blood. But it wasn't the dirty brown blood left by the bear. This was fresher. And most importantly, this scrap was hanging on a branch that led in a completely different direction. Not south, toward the swamps, but north, toward an old, abandoned hut. Pavel brought the rag to his face. It had almost no smell. But he still caught a faint scent, the smell of a dog, and another, wild, musky smell. A wolf. At that moment, everything fell into place. The shot, the bear, Petrovich, and the wolf. He looked north. His face hardened. "He tricked us," he said quietly. "He wasn't chasing the bear. He's hiding someone." Stepan looked at him incredulously, then at the piece of cloth. "A wolf? But why?" "I don't know," Pavel replied. "But we'll find out now." He took out his radio. "Base, this is First. We're in Square 17. We found wolf tracks, possibly wounded. There are human tracks nearby. We're moving to the old hut by Black Creek. Repeat, to the old hut. Over." Ivan, who had reached the hill above the hut with his last ounce of strength, heard the distant crackle of the radio. He couldn't make out the words, but he understood everything. His plan had failed. They were coming here. Despair was cold and sticky like swamp water. Ivan understood everything. His trick had only given them a few hours' delay. Now the game was over. He saw two figures flash by at the foot of the hill. Hunters. They were walking quickly, confidently, straight toward the hut. In 5 minutes, they would be here. 5 minutes to save the wolf. 5 minutes to decide its fate. There was nowhere to run. Trying to negotiate was pointless. To them, a wolf near a human, especially a wounded one, was fair game, a dangerous beast that had to be eliminated. The law was on their side. And then, in the old forester's mind, A final, desperate plan was born. A plan that could cost him everything. He couldn't save the wolf by convincing them, but he could force them. He slid down the hill and ran to the hut. "Rex, inside! Quick!" he hissed. The dog, not understanding what was happening, darted into the dark opening. Ivan looked inside. Gray lay with his head raised, his yellow eyes burning with alarm. "Stay down, both of you. Quiet. Not a sound, no matter what happens. Rex, do you understand? Be quiet," Ivan ordered. He looked at his hand, which he had used to bandage the wolf yesterday. There were brown stains of dried blood on it. That was what he needed. He quickly tore the sleeve of his old jacket. Then he took the bloody bandage off Gray, stained the torn fabric and his hand with fresh blood. He quickly wrapped his arm with the improvised bandage. It was clumsy, but in the confusion, it should work. He grabbed his rifle, ran out of the hut, and took a few steps back. He could hear their voices. They were already very close. Ivan took a deep breath, raised the rifle in the air, and fired. The silence was broken again by a loud bang. But this time, it was not a hunter's shot. It was a distress signal. Immediately after the shot, he threw the rifle aside and collapsed on the ground at the door of the hut, clutching his wounded arm to his chest. He lay there, breathing heavily, and waited. Half a minute later, Pavel ran out into the clearing, followed by Stepan. They saw Ivan lying on the ground and rushed to him. "Petrovich, are you alive? What happened?" Pavel shouted, kneeling down beside him. "A wolf!" Ivan croaked, feigning pain and weakness. "He's in the hut. He attacked me when I went in. I managed to shoot him." Pavel looked at Ivan's hand, then at his face. Without thinking twice, Stepan picked up Ivan's rifle, checked the chamber, and headed resolutely for the door. "That's it, Gray. You've had your fun," he said. "A wolf that attacks a human being must be shot on the spot. Stand back, Pasha. I'll take care of it." "Stop!" Pavel shouted, jumping up and blocking Stepan's way. "What's going on?" his partner asked impatiently. "Something's not right," Pavel said, keeping his eyes on Ivan. His gaze was sharp and intense. It was the gaze of a man who had been trained to notice the smallest details. "Petrovich, where did he bite you? Show me the wound." Ivan hesitated. "My arm. My shoulder. He clawed me," he muttered, trying not to meet the gaze of his former student. Pavel carefully touched Ivan's bandage. "There's blood, but no wound," he said quietly but firmly. "That's not a bite. And the jacket is torn too neatly. You're lying to us, Petrovich. What's really going on here?" Ivan's heart sank. He had underestimated Pavel. He had underestimated his powers of observation and how well he knew him. Stepan looked from one to the other in confusion. "Pash, what's wrong with you? A man's been hurt, he needs help, and you're interrogating him. There's a dangerous animal inside him." "There's a wounded animal inside him," Pavel corrected him. "And Petrovich didn't kill him. He's protecting him. Why, Petrovich? Why did you need this circus with the attack?" Ivan was silent. He understood that his plan had failed. Now everything depended on whether Pavel would believe him, whether he could get through to him. He saved Rex," Ivan finally managed to say. "And me. From the bear. The bear wounded him. I couldn't leave him." Stepan burst out laughing. "Are you out of your mind, old man? A wolf saved a dog? They're enemies. He would have torn your Rex to pieces. And where's the dog, by the way?" At that moment, as if in response to his words, a quiet but distinct whimper came from behind the tightly closed door of the hut. Rex couldn't take it anymore. He heard his master's voice. He heard strange voices, and he couldn't remain in the dark any longer. That sound was like a death sentence. Now everyone knew that there was more than one wolf in the hut. There was also a dog. "So that's what it is," Stepan said, his face turning to stone. "You've got a whole zoo in there. Petrovich, you've broken every rule in the book. Harboring a predator, illegal shooting. Do you understand what will happen to you?" "I don't care what happens to me," Ivan said quietly, struggling to his feet. "Just don't hurt him. He's not dangerous. He's wounded and scared." "A wounded animal is the most dangerous animal," Stepan snapped. "Get out of the way, Petrovich. I'm following orders." He pushed Ivan aside and stepped toward the door, raising his rifle. Pavel stood between him and the door again. "Stepan, wait. Let's talk this over." "What is there to talk about?" he snapped. "The old man has lost his mind. He dragged a dog into the forest, provoked a bear, and now he's befriending a wolf. This has to stop." "I said wait." Pavel's voice was steely. He turned to Ivan. "Petrovich, tell him the whole truth, right now. Otherwise, I can't help you." And Ivan told him everything. About how he had abandoned Rex, about how his conscience had tormented him, about how the wolf had nursed his dog back to health, about the fight with the bear and how he had been wounded. He spoke, his voice trembling. He did not ask for leniency. He simply stated the facts. When he finished, silence fell over the clearing. Stepan looked at him as if he were crazy. But Pavel listened attentively, and his face gradually changed. He looked at his old teacher and saw not a lawbreaker, but a man who had reached the depths of despair and remorse. "Even if it's true," Stepan broke the silence, "it doesn't change anything. A wolf is a predator. Today it saved a dog, but tomorrow it will kill a child in the village. We can't take the risk. Orders are orders." "To hell with orders," Pavel replied sharply. "Are we not human? We can't just come and kill an animal that saved a man's life." "It's not a human, it's a wolf, and it's wounded. Maybe it has rabies?" Stepan wouldn't let up. The argument grew louder. They stood a few steps away from the hut, waving their arms, and didn't notice a pair of small, angry eyes watching them from the thicket. The wounded bear hadn't gone far. The smell of blood and human habitation drew him back. The pain made him even more aggressive and unpredictable. Slowly, almost silently, he emerged into the clearing, and his target was not the animals locked in the hut. His target was the people standing with their backs to him. Ivan was the first to notice it. He saw the bushes swaying behind the arguing hunters and saw a huge brown shadow. "Bear!" he shouted in a voice that wasn't his own. Pavel and Stepan spun around. The beast was already 20 meters away and quickly closing the distance. Stepan raised his rifle, but his hands trembled with surprise and fear. He fired, but the bullet only grazed the ground at the bear's paws, enraging it even more. The bear roared and lunged forward. At that very moment, the door of the hut burst open. A gray flash burst out of the dark opening. It was Gray. Wounded, weakened, but not broken. He did not rush at the bear. That would have been certain death. Instead, he did the unthinkable. Ignoring the people, he darted straight under the paws of the enraged beast, sank his teeth into its healthy hind leg, and immediately jumped back, pulling the giant away from the motionless hunters. Rex jumped out after him, barking desperately. The old Labrador, forgetting the pain in his joints, circled around the bear, creating additional chaos and preventing the beast from focusing on a single target. The bear roared, blinded by rage. His main enemy was now this pesky wolf, who had already hurt him once. He forgot about the people and threw all his weight at Gray. The wolf dodged the direct blow, but was unable to escape the clawed paw. He was thrown several meters away and, whimpering from the piercing pain, struggled to get back on his feet. His wounded side was bleeding again. This maneuver, this sacrifice that cost the wolf his last ounce of strength, gave the people 2 precious seconds. And that was enough. Pavel, as if awakening from a stupor, raised his rifle. There was no panic in his actions, only the cold calculation of a professional. He caught the bear's head in the crosshairs at the very moment when it was turning to make its decisive leap at the wolf. The shot rang out dry and clear. The bear twitched, froze for a moment, and then fell heavily to the ground like a felled tree, raising a cloud of dust and last year's leaves. Absolute silence reigned in the clearing. No one moved. Stepan stood with his rifle lowered, his face white as a sheet. He looked at the huge, lifeless body of the bear, then at the heavily breathing wolf, who was staggering over his friend Rex, and finally at Ivan Petrovich. There was more than just shock in his eyes. It was the collapse of his entire world, built on clear instructions and rules. Pavel slowly lowered his rifle. He walked over to the bear, made sure it was dead, and only then turned to Ivan. His gaze was heavy, but there was no condemnation in it. "Now I believe you, Petrovich," he said quietly. Stepan was silent. He simply sat down on a fallen tree and wrapped his arms around his head. Everything he knew about the forest, about animals, about the rules, had been shattered in the last 10 minutes. The wolf he had been about to shoot had just saved his life. "What are we going to do?" he finally asked hoarsely, looking at Pavel. Pavel did not answer right away. He went over to Ivan, took the rag from his hands, moistened it with water from the flask, and handed it to him. "Clean the wound, properly," he said, nodding toward the wolf. Then he turned to Stepan. "In the report, we'll write, we came upon the trail of a wounded bear that posed a threat. When we tried to kill it, the animal attacked. Petrovich was nearby and was injured. We were forced to open fire to kill it. Everything was done according to instructions." "What about the wolf?" Stepan didn't understand. "What wolf?" Pavel looked him straight in the eye. "I don't see any wolf here. I see Petrovich's old dog and a dead bear. Do you?" Stepan looked at his young partner, and in his eyes he saw slow understanding and belated respect. He saw before him not just a boy hunter, but a true master of the taiga, capable of making decisions that were not written in any manual. He nodded silently. Pavel went over to his backpack and took out a small first aid kit. He pulled out a bottle of antiseptic, a sterile bandage, and a syringe with antibiotics. He handed it all to Ivan. "You know what to do with this. Calculate the dosage based on his weight. I think he weighs about 70 kilograms. Stay here until he can walk. We'll go back to the village and tell them you're helping us butcher the carcass. That'll give you a couple of days." Ivan took the first aid kit with trembling hands. He looked at Pavel, this young man whom he had once taught to read tracks, and couldn't say a word. He just nodded, and a tear rolled down his cheek. The hunters left, leaving behind silence and the smell of gunpowder. Ivan was left alone with his strange family. He gave the wolf an injection, as the vet had once taught him. Then he carefully washed and bandaged the wound. This time, Gray did not resist. He lay with his head on his paws and simply looked at the man with tired but grateful eyes. Rex lay nearby, pressed against the side of his wild friend. Ivan spent 3 days at the hut. 3 days that changed him forever. He cared for the wolf, sharing his meager food with him and Rex. He talked to them, telling them about his life, his late wife, his guilt. And they listened. Rex looked at him loyally. Gray listened attentively, his head tilted slightly to one side, his ear torn. On the fourth day, the wolf was able to stand up and, although limping, took a few steps. The wound was healing. Ivan realized that his help was no longer needed. The forest would heal its son. In the morning, he gathered his empty backpack. "Well, friends," he said, patting Rex and, after a moment, touching Gray's stiff fur, "it's time for me to go." Rex whimpered and got up, ready to follow him. But Ivan shook his head. "No, boy. Your home is here now. With him." He nodded toward the wolf. "You are his pack, and he is yours." He hugged his dog one last time, turned, and walked away without looking back. He knew that if he looked back, he would not be able to leave. He returned to his village a different man. The emptiness in his house no longer seemed deafening. It was filled with meaning, memories, and quiet joy. He knew that deep in the forest, his faithful friend was well. Once a week, on Thursdays, Ivan would get into his old UAs and drive to the edge of the forest. He would leave a large piece of meat there, bought from a local farmer, and drive away. He never waited to see them. It was enough for him to know. But one autumn day, as he was about to leave, he looked toward the forest and saw them. They stood on top of the hill, two silhouettes against the crimson sunset. One was pale and stocky. The other was gray and powerful. They just stood there and looked in his direction. They didn't approach. They just let him know they remembered. Even smiled. For the first time in many years, he felt peace in his heart. He forgave himself, and he knew that they had forgiven him. He started the car and drove home, leaving behind the forest where a wild wolf and an old dog had become symbols of impossible friendship and great forgiveness. Did Pavel do the right thing by hiding the truth about the wolf? Or should he have followed the instructions, no matter what?